Why was she always the one no one noticed at the table? Even in uniform, even with her stripes, Sergeant Riley Chun had learned to live in the shadows. She wasn't the loudest voice in the briefing room. She wasn't the soldier who barked orders or cracked jokes to cut the tension. She was the one who kept her sleeves rolled up, her hands busy, her eyes sharp. People passed her in hallways, nodded with respect, but rarely lingered. And maybe that was by design. Maybe that was survival. That night, the desert smelled of oil, diesel, and sweat. A heavy silence pressed down on forward operating base Kandahar until the sirens shattered it. The sound was sharp, metallic, pulling every soldier out of whatever small refuge they'd carved for themselves. A convoy was inbound. Critically wounded soldiers. An IED had destroyed their original evacuation route. The only way left was a mountain pass no one trusted. That path required every available armored vehicle, and half the fleet was down. Riley slid beneath a disabled Humvee, her headlamp cutting through the dust and shadows of the motor pool. She moved with the rhythm of someone who had done this 100 times before. Each motion crisp, efficient. Her fingertips traced the ruptured fuel line, following it from the tank to the block. Her lips pressed into a thin line. This wasn't patchable, not for the road ahead. It needed replacing fully, and fast. Around her, voices barked across the motor pool. Metal clanged, wrenches slipped, boots scraped on concrete. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez cursed at a stubborn transmission on the far end. Others worked frantically on overheating engines, jammed turrets, stripped bolts, all of them racing against an invisible clock. The convoy was 3 hours away, but in the mountains, 3 hours was nothing. "Sean, how long on that Humvee?" Rodriguez's voice echoed. 40 minutes. Riley shouted back without looking up, already reaching for her cutting tool. 40 minutes if nothing else went wrong. The base floodlights burned harsh against the night, throwing stark shadows across steel and sand. Riley's hands worked by instinct. Loosening fittings, cutting away the worn line, she'd learned to feel her way as much as see, to listen to the machine as though it were breathing under her hands. Every soldier out there on that convoy was counting on her. They would never know her name, never see her face. But their survival might hinge on the care she put into every connection, every tightened bolt, every drop of fuel that reached the engine. Her sweat dripped, stinging her eyes. She wiped her sleeve across her forehead. And as she did, the light caught something on her forearm, a tattoo, not the kind most soldiers wore, black and gray ink, delicate and sharp at once. A military dog. Tag, a name inscribed above it, Ghost. Beneath it, a date. 15 years ago. Below that, coordinates and a phrase in Dari script. Most assumed it was just a memorial. Everyone in the army had lost someone. Tattoos were common enough, but for Riley, it wasn't just ink. It was memory. It was lost burned into her skin so she would never forget. She tightened the last bolt on the new line, her breath shallow. The engine would live again. One vehicle. Saved. One piece of the puzzle back in place. But the math was cruel. They needed 7, maybe 8 to make it through. Right now, they had 5. 5 meant hard choices. Who was rescued first? Who was left behind? And Riley had lived long. Enough to know that every number carried a name, a face, a family. The helicopters arrived overhead, their rotors thumping a steady rhythm, medevac birds, positioning for the wounded. Riley felt the weight of the night shift on her shoulders. Footsteps echoed behind her, heavy, purposeful. She thought it was Rodriguez coming to check, without. Looking up, she muttered, "Almost done. 10 more minutes to test connections." No answer. Something in the silence froze her. This wasn't the easy quiet of another mechanic watching her work. It was heavier, studying, measuring. Riley slid out from beneath the vehicle, grease staining her hands, rag in her grip. She blinked into the glare of the lights and froze. 3. Stars gleamed on the collar of the man standing before her, General Marcus Webb. "Sir," she said sharply, snapping to attention. "Sergeant Chun reporting. Vehicle operational in 8 minutes." But Webb wasn't looking at the Humvee. His eyes were fixed on her arm. "That's an interesting tattoo," he said, his voice lower than she expected. "Mind if I ask about it?" Riley glanced down, instinctively tugging her sleeve lower for just a flicker. Her mask slipped, fear flashing in her eyes, then vanishing. "Memorial, sir," she said softly. "For a military working dog, Afghanistan, the general's." Face shifted, like someone had struck him. His jaw tightened. His hand brushed unconsciously against his chest, where his own dog tags rested beneath his shirt. "Ghost," he whispered. The rag dropped from Riley's hand. Her blood went cold. The world tilted, her lips parted, words barely forming. "How? How do you know that name, sir?" Webb's voice caught, but he forced it steady. "Because Ghost was my dog." The motor pool around them blurred into silence. Engines hummed. Men shouted orders. Wrenches clanged on steel, but for Riley, everything narrowed to those words. 15 years collapsed in an instant. A village outside Marja, gunfire ripping the air. A grenade, blood, and a dog. A dog who hadn't just been muscle and training. A dog who had been loyalty embodied. Her chest tightened, her knees threatened to buckle. The general's gaze locked on hers, sharp and searching. There was a girl there that day, a child who tried to save him, who whispered prayers as he bled. His breath shook. "Are you?" Riley's throat closed, the name she buried for years pressed against her lips, threatening to break free, but she swallowed it back. The general stepped closer, his voice breaking through the years. "What's your real name, Sergeant?" The question hung in the air like a live grenade. For 15 years, Riley had hidden. She had lived under a name that wasn't hers, an identity built from forged papers, refugee channels, and silence. Every day since she enlisted, she had carried the weight of discovery pressing down on her chest. Her pulse thundered in her ears. The sound of helicopters, the weight of the desert night, the sharp memory of her father's voice, telling her to be brave. Her lips parted, she looked at the general, at the man who had once cradled his dying dog in the dust, the man whose soldiers her father had given his life to protect, and the words broke free. "My name was Roya Amdi." The silence cracked open between them. Webb's eyes widened, and for the first time in years, Riley's world began to unravel. What happens when the truth you've buried for 15 years suddenly sees daylight? Riley couldn't breathe. The words were out, trembling in the air between them. "My name was Roya Amdi." Once spoken, there was no pulling them back. General Webb's face was unreadable at first shock. Recognition, disbelief, all colliding at once. He stared at her like a ghost had materialized out of the desert dust. "Jamil Amdi's daughter," he said finally, not a question, a certainty. Riley's eyes burned. The name of her father hung heavy, as if the sound alone could split her chest open. "Yes," she whispered. "My father was your interpreter." The general's jaw tightened. He remembered Jamil, a man with keen eyes, a quick smile, and an instinct for danger that had saved his men more than once. He remembered the ambush, the chaos, the firefight. He remembered Jamil falling, tackling an insurgent to the ground before the man could reach wounded soldiers. Webb had thought of that moment countless times since, but he hadn't known the girl had survived. "You were there," Webb said, his voice breaking. "The day Ghost died." Riley swallowed hard, fighting back tears. Images she had locked away for years crashed into her. The dirt, the blood, the smell of smoke. Her father's body, Ghost's fading breath. She had been 12, a child trying to be brave. A child who whispered prayers into the ear of a dying dog while bullets tore the air around her. "Yes," she said, her voice cracked. "I was the girl." The rag lay forgotten on the concrete between them. Soldiers shouted in the distance. Engines roared. But in that moment, nothing else existed. Just the two of them, bound by a memory neither could escape. Webb's chest rose and fell heavily. "I looked for you," he admitted. His voice was rough, almost pleading. "I searched refugee lists, aid camps, reports. They told me no one from Jamil's family had survived. My aunt came for me," Riley whispered. Her eyes cast down. "She smuggled me out, paid men who forged papers. She told me to stay silent, to never tell anyone my real name. If the Taliban found out whose daughter I was..." Her voice faltered. "They would have hunted me, and maybe her too." Webb felt a sharp pang in his chest. All those years, he had carried guilt over losing Ghost, guilt over Jamil's death, guilt over the little girl he couldn't save. And now she was standing in front of him, alive, grown, wearing the uniform of his army. "You enlisted," he said softly, searching her face. "You carried all this, and you still chose to serve?" Riley lifted her chin. The grease-stained rag trembled in her hand. Her voice steadied. "This is my country now. General, my father died believing in what you were trying to do. I had nothing left. America gave me a life. I wanted to give something back." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Webb studied her face, searching for traces of the girl from that night, the girl who had whispered prayers into his dog's fur, who had clung to hope while everything burned. And he saw it, not in her features, but in the quiet strength of her eyes. But with recognition came dread. "Do you understand what you've done?" Webb asked quietly. "If anyone else learns the truth, if military intelligence digs deeper into your file, you could lose everything. Your career, your citizenship, even your freedom." "I know." Riley's voice was firm, but her eyes flickered with fear. "I've known since the day I signed my enlistment papers. Every morning I wake up knowing today might be the day someone finds out. But I couldn't live any other way. My father's blood. It's part of me. Hiding forever wasn't an option. Serving was the only way I could honor him." Her words cut through Webb like a blade. She was braver than most soldiers he had led into battle. Brave in silence, brave in carrying a secret too heavy for anyone her age should have borne. He exhaled slowly, his mind racing. He could turn her in. He should. The regulations demanded it. A soldier with a false identity was a liability. It was his duty to report her immediately. But duty wasn't always so simple. Webb's hand brushed the dog tags under his shirt again. Ghost's tags. He remembered the promise he had whispered to the dying shepherd as Royano. Riley had held his paw. "I'll protect them. I'll protect her." And here she was. His throat tightened. "How many people know who you really are?" Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Just you," she hesitated. "My aunt. But she's gone now. Cancer, 3 years ago." Silence pressed between them. Riley's hand shook as she tucked the rag into her pocket, as if clinging to the pretense of being just another mechanic. But she wasn't, and now Webb knew it. The general looked around the motor pool. The floodlights, the grease, the noise of repairs. They had no privacy here. This conversation could not continue in the open. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "We'll talk again, somewhere safe. But hear me now. Your father would be proud of you. More than you know." Riley's breath caught. Her eyes shimmering. For a heartbeat, she looked like that 12-year-old again. Vulnerable, desperate to believe him. And then the spell broke. Soldiers shouted orders. Engines roared back to life. The convoy was still hours away, but the work wasn't done. The war wasn't pausing for either of them. Riley forced her mask back on. She snapped to attention. "Yes, sir." Webb gave a curt nod, but inside his world had shifted. He had found her. The girl he had lost. The child who had risked her life for a dying dog. And now, the woman who had become one of his soldiers. As he walked away, Webb's chest burned with conflict. If he kept her secret, he broke the law. If he exposed her, he destroyed her life. Either way, he carried the weight now. And Riley? She slid back beneath the Humvee, her hands steady on the tools, her breath ragged in her chest. Her secret was no longer hers alone. The wall she had built for 15 years had cracked. Above her, The tattoo burned in the floodlight glow. Ghost, the coordinates, the prayer in Dari. She had inked it to remember, but tonight it had remembered her. And somewhere in the dark, with helicopters circling, wounded soldiers fighting for their lives, and engines rumbling back to power, Riley knew something with chilling certainty. Her world had just changed forever. How do you rebuild a life when the past never lets you go? Riley asked herself that question every time she looked in the mirror. Every time she saw the tattoo etched into her forearm. Every time someone called her Sergeant Chun, a name that wasn't really hers that night. After the Humvee roared back to life and the motor pool filled with the sound of engines readying for the mountain pass, she lay awake in her cot. Sleep never came easily. The desert wind rattled the thin walls of the barracks, carrying with it the smell of oil and sand. But tonight, her chest was tight with something else. The general knew for 15 years. Silence had been her shield. Now, for the first time, someone else carried her secret, and not just anyone. The man who had held Ghost as he died. Riley closed her eyes, and the past came back like a storm. She was 12 again, crouched behind a crumbling mud wall outside Marja. Gunfire cracked overhead. Dust stung her throat. Her father's voice shouted commands in English and Dari, his words lost in the chaos. And beside her Ghost, his ears pricked, his body tense, his fur trembling. Under her fingers, the grenade came fast, a blur, a sound, then an explosion that shook the ground. Ghost lunged, placing himself between the blast and the soldiers. The shockwave threw Riley against the wall. When she scrambled up, the dog was down, bleeding, his chest rising and falling in shallow gasps. She remembered the smell of blood, the grit between her teeth, the way her heart slammed against her ribs. Soldiers were shouting, firing, fighting for their lives. But she only saw Ghost. She crawled to him, her small hands pressed against the wound, trying to stop what couldn't be stopped. Her father's voice called out, but she barely heard him. She whispered prayers in Dari, words her grandmother had taught her, words for the souls of faithful animals. And then Ghost's eyes closed. His breathing stopped. She had been the one to shut his eyes. Moments later, the firefight swallowed everything. Her father's body fell. The air turned black with smoke. By the time the helicopters came, nothing of her old life remained. The memory stabbed through her. Chest like glass, Riley sat up in her cot, her breath shallow, her hands trembling. She pressed her palm against the tattoo on her arm, as though holding the memory in place. Ghost, her father, the prayer, all etched into her skin so she would never forget who she was or who she had lost. But survival had demanded forgetting. Survival had demanded silence. Her aunt had pulled her from the wreckage, her voice fierce and trembling. "You must never tell anyone," she had said. "Not your name, not who your father was. They will come for you. They will kill you." And Riley had obeyed, a smuggled identity, a refugee camp, America. Years of trying to blend in, to bury her accent, to erase her story, until the day she signed her enlistment papers, her false name written in perfect block letters. Riley Chun. She had thought she could carry it forever. But now, Webb knew, and Webb was remembering too. In his quarters that night, the general sat with Ghost's dog tags pressed in his fist. 15 years of guilt pressed heavier than the weight of command. He saw the girl's face again, dirt-streaked and terrified, yet brave beyond reason. He saw Jamil smile, the interpreter who had saved his men, time and again, and he saw his own failures. He should have found her. He should have protected her. Instead, she had been left to navigate the world alone, carrying a burden no child should bear. And now she had built a life on a lie. A soldier, a mechanic, a leader her unit relied on. What was his duty? To report her? To protect her? To risk everything, his career, his reputation, to keep a promise he hadn't even realized he'd made 15 years ago? The questions tore at him long into the night. Days passed. The convoy made it through the mountains. Vehicles broke down, but none that Riley had touched. Wounded soldiers reached safety. In the chaos of war, there was no time for quiet revelations. But the secret between Riley and Webb was a silent weight neither could shake. In the motor pool, Riley worked harder than ever, her jaw set, her eyes sharper, but inside she felt hollow. Every conversation, every passing glance carried the risk that someone might see what Webb had seen. One question too many, one background check too deep, and everything she had built would crumble. The army was her life, her purpose, her way of honoring her father. To lose it would be to lose herself all over again. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the desert sky turned the color of rust and ash, Webb found her again. He approached quietly, his boots crunching on gravel. Riley stiffened, the wrench in her hand pausing mid-turn. "Sergeant," he said softly. She looked up, her eyes wary. "Sir." "Walk with me." They moved past the motor pool, past the floodlights, past the noise of engines, into the shadows where only the hum of generators filled the silence. Webb stopped, his eyes on the horizon. "I made a promise once," he said finally, "to your father, to protect his family. I thought I failed that day, but you're here. You survived. You've honored him more than I ever could." Riley's throat tightened. "And now? What happens now?" Webb's jaw clenched. He had rehearsed answers in his mind orders. Regulations, warnings, but none of them felt right in this moment. He turned to her, his voice heavy. "Now, I carry this with you, whatever it costs." Her breath caught. For a long moment, she searched his eyes, looking for doubt, for hesitation. She found none. But fear lingered. "If they find out, they won't." Webb cut her off gently. "Not if I can help it." It was reckless. It was dangerous. It was against every regulation. But it was the truth. And sometimes truth had to outweigh rules. Riley exhaled, her shoulders trembling with relief and dread all at once. She wanted to trust him. She wanted to believe that, for once, she didn't have to carry this secret alone. But deep inside, a darker thought gnawed at her. If her secret ever surfaced, it wouldn't just be her life at risk. The Taliban had long memories, and she had just painted a target on anyone who dared to stand beside her. The desert wind whipped across the base, carrying with it whispers of the past. Riley's eyes lifted to the stars. Somewhere out there, her father's memory lingered. Somewhere out there, ghost spirits still ran, and in the silence, a question echoed in her chest. Could she ever truly outrun who she was? What if the truth you hide isn't only your own? That thought stayed with General Webb as he sat at his desk, the desert night pressing against the thin walls of his office. Reports cluttered the table. Radio chatter hummed in the background. But none of it held his attention. His eyes were locked on a single folder. Riley Chun's file. Officially, she was exactly what she claimed to be. Born in a village destroyed by conflict. Orphaned. Resettled through a refugee program. Enlisted at 18. 6 years of service without blemish. The record was clean. Too clean. And Webb knew why. It wasn't real. He leaned back, rubbing his temples. Regulations told him to report her. Duty demanded it. Yet every time he pictured her face, every time he remembered that dirt-streaked 12-year-old girl whispering prayers into Ghost's fur, he couldn't. Duty was supposed to be clear. But what do you do when it collides with humanity? The knock on his door came late, sharp against the quiet. Webb tensed, sliding the file closed. "Come in." Colonel Sarah Martinez stepped inside, Dia patch on her shoulder, her eyes sharp as a blade. "Evening, sir." Webb nodded, masking the unease coiling in his gut. "Colonel." She didn't sit. She hovered, stunning him, as though she already knew something. "We've been picking up chatter," she said finally. "Insurgent networks digging into old interpreter files. Family, survivors." Webb's breath caught. He kept his face neutral. "Still?" Martinez nodded. They haven't forgotten. Helmand Province interpreters were high-value targets. Some of those families vanished into the refugee system, and some may still be alive. Her words hit like shrapnel. Webb gripped the edge of the desk, steadying himself. What kind of chatter? They've tracked down several in Europe, Martinez said, her voice grim. 2 murdered in the past year. A 3rd barely escaped. They're patient, they're methodical, and they don't forgive. The air in the room thickened. Webb forced his voice to remain even. What's Dia doing about it? Protective lists, monitoring, but it's difficult. Some of these identities were unofficial, forged, covered up in the chaos of resettlement. Her eyes narrowed. You'd be surprised how many slip through cracks in the system. Webb's chest tightened. Was that suspicion in her tongue? Or just coincidence? He couldn't be sure. I'll keep it in mind, he said finally. Martinez gave a small nod, but a gaze lingered on him. Then she turned and left, her boots echoing down the hall. Webb sat in silence, his pulse pounding. The walls seemed to close in. They were already looking, already circling, if Riley's name surfaced. If anyone traced those forged documents back to her, she would be a target not just for bureaucracy, but for killers with long memories. He pressed his hand against ghosts. Tags beneath his shirt, the promise weighed heavier than ever. Across the base, Riley was restless. She sat on a crate outside the motor pool, the night air cool against her sweat-soaked skin. Around her, the world never slept. Vehicles rolled, guards patrolled. Distant artillery thundered like the heartbeat of a relentless war. But inside, it was too quiet. She kept replaying the general's words. Your father would be proud. She wanted to believe him, needed to, but pride didn't erase danger. Pride didn't protect her if her secret came out. She pulled her sleeve back, tracing the ink on her arm. The coordinates, the date, the prayer, her father's last words to her. Be brave, survive, make me proud. She had survived, she had served, but the bravery part. Tonight it felt heavier. Bravery wasn't just crawling through gunfire. It was living every day with the fear that tomorrow it could all come crashing down. Footsteps approached. Rodriguez, her staff sergeant, dropped onto the crate beside her, a cigarette glowing between his fingers. You don't sleep either, huh? He muttered. Riley forced a small smile. Not much. Rodriguez exhaled smoke into the night, his eyes scanning the shadows. We're lucky we had you on that Humvee. Damn thing would have died halfway up that pass if it wasn't for your hands. The compliment hit her chest like a weight. She nodded, but didn't answer. Rodriguez studied her for a moment, then shook his head. You know, for someone who saves everyone's ass, you sure don't talk much about yourself. Her throat tightened. She kept her eyes on the ground. Nothing worth saying, Rodriguez snorted. Yeah, right. You've got that look. What look? The look of someone carrying more than a toolbox. His words struck too close. Riley forced a laugh, shook her head, and stood. Get some sleep, Sarge. Convoy tomorrow. She walked away before he could press further. She couldn't afford to let cracks show. Not here. Not with anyone but Webb. And yet, cracks were already forming. 3 days later, a message arrived from headquarters. Routine security review, randomized background checks, standard procedure. Nothing to worry about, unless your whole life was built on a name that wasn't real. When Webb read the notice, his stomach dropped. 6 weeks. That was the timeline. 6 weeks before someone with access to deeper files started pulling threads. 6 weeks before Riley's cover unraveled. He called her into his office late that evening. The barracks were quiet, most soldiers asleep or on shift. Riley stood at attention, her eyes steady, but Webb could see the tension in her jaw. Close the door, he said. She obeyed. He leaned forward, elbows on the desk, voice low. A security review is coming. 6 weeks. They'll look deeper than normal if they find the cracks. Her heart hammered in her chest. She forced herself to meet his eyes. Then it's over. Webb's silence confirmed it. Riley's hands curled into fists at her sides. She had lived with fear for years. But this was different. This wasn't a vague someday. This was a deadline. What do I do? She asked finally, her voice breaking. Webb stared at her for a long moment, then leaned back. We find a way. There are programs for interpreter families, pathways to citizenship, protections. If we can document your father's service, we may have a case. Her breath caught. But that means revealing who I am. If the wrong people find out, I know. His voice was rough. The risk is real, not just to you, to anyone tied to you. The weight pressed between them. For a long moment, Riley thought about her father, about his choice to stand and fight, knowing it meant death, about her aunt's sacrifice to smuggle her out, about years of silence, years of pretending, and she thought about the general, the man who now carried her secret like it was his own. "Sir," she said softly, "if helping me puts others in danger, maybe it's not worth it." Webb's eyes hardened. He shook his head. "Some promises are worth any risk." His words landed like a stone in her chest. Riley looked away, her throat tight. She wanted to believe that. She wanted to believe her father's sacrifice, Ghost's death, her own years of silence. They all led here for a reason. But belief was dangerous. Hope was dangerous. 6 weeks. That was all she had. And in the shadows beyond Kandahar, men she had never met were already whispering her father's name, already hunting. How do you hold steady when every day feels like a countdown? Riley woke with that thought every morning now. The calendar had become a silent enemy. 6 weeks, then 5. Each sunrise pressed heavier on her chest. Outwardly, nothing changed. She still rolled out of her cot before dawn, still pulled on her uniform, still smeared her hands with grease and sweat in the motor pool. Engines still broke, convoys still rolled, orders still came. War didn't pause for secrets, but inside, she felt the tremor. Every time someone said her name, Sergeant Chun, it struck her like a bell, a reminder, a question. Was she Riley? Was she Roya? Was she both? Or was she neither, trapped between? A past she couldn't claim and a present that could collapse any moment. One evening, after hours of work, she sat alone beside a Humvee, its hood propped open like a wounded chest. The desert was quiet, only the faint hum of generators in the distance. She leaned her head against the metal, eyes closed. Her father's voice came back to her, faint, as though carried on the wind. Be brave, survive, make me proud. She had survived. But bravery, it felt like a lie, and pride she wondered if she deserved it. Footsteps approached. She opened her eyes to see Rodriguez again, cigarette glowing between his fingers. "You're burning out," he muttered, settling beside her. "Even you can't run this hard forever." Riley gave a small, tight smile. "Engines don't fix themselves." He studied her, smoke curling into the night. "It's not just the engines, is it?" Her chest tightened. For a second, she thought he knew, thought somehow he had seen through the layers she'd built. But Rodriguez just shook his head. "I've seen that look before. Soldiers carrying ghosts." He tapped his chest with 2 fingers. "Doesn't matter if it's buddies, family, something else. They follow you. And if you don't talk, they eat you alive." Riley forced a laugh, though it cracked at the edges. "Maybe I just like engines better than people." He grinned faintly, but his eyes stayed sharp. "Engines don't ask questions. People do." She looked away. "Exactly." Silence stretched between them. Rodriguez flicked the ash from his cigarette, then stood. "Well, for what it's worth, if you ever want to unload something, I'm not bad at listening." Riley nodded. Keeping her eyes on the ground, he walked away, leaving her alone with the machines and the memories. She couldn't talk, not to Rodriguez, not to anyone but Webb, and even that was dangerous. Every word spoken aloud felt like tightening the noose. Yet part of her wanted to. Part of her wanted to scream her real name to the sky, to stop pretending, to stop being a shadow. to be Roya Amdi, daughter of Jamil, child of Afghanistan, soldier of America, to stop dividing herself into pieces, but she couldn't. Survival demanded silence. Across the base, General Webb was burning his own nights. In silence, his office lights glowed long past midnight, stacks of papers rising like barricades around him. He made quiet calls through secure lines, reaching out to old contacts in intelligence, in the State Department, and refugee services. Every file he pulled, every document he unearthed, painted a picture of Jamil Amdi, the interpreter who had saved lives, the man whose sacrifice had gone unrecognized in official records. 12 separate instances, 3 suicide bombers identified before they could strike, dozens of soldiers alive because of him. Jamil had been more than an interpreter. He had been a shield, a bridge between worlds. And yet, his family had been erased by paperwork, swallowed by the fog of war. Webb's jaw tightened as he studied the reports. Roya had slipped through the system on false papers. If exposed, she risked not only discharge and deportation, but something far worse. Because Colonel Martinez had been right. The Taliban's reach was long, and Roya Amdi was a name they had not forgotten. He stared at Ghost's dog tags in his hand, the metal cool against his skin. He remembered that promise. I'll protect her. He couldn't fail again, Riley. Meanwhile, carried her own battles. Nights were the worst. When the barracks finally fell silent, when the hum of engines faded, when she was alone with her thoughts, sleep rarely came. Instead, she lay on her cot staring at the ceiling, her mind replaying the fragments of a life she had buried. Her father's laughter, the sound of Dari prayers whispered at dawn, the weight of ghost fur under her small hands, her aunt's fierce eyes as she shoved papers into her hand and whispered, "Don't speak your real name." There were moments she almost forgot. Years when Riley Chun felt real, solid, whole. But the tattoo always pulled her back. Ghost, the date, the coordinates, the prayer. A scar disguised as ink. One night, she dreamed of the ambush, the dirt, the fire, ghosts. Body in her arms. But this time, when she whispered the prayer, the dog opened its eyes and spoke with her father's voice. Be brave, survive, make me proud. She woke with tears on her cheeks and a hollow ache in her chest. The next morning, she forced herself into routine. That was how you survived. One bolt at a time, one engine at a time, one day at a time. She poured herself into the machines. Her hands steady even when her heart was not. But the cracks showed. Rodriguez noticed her silences. Younger soldiers whispered that she seemed different lately, more distant, and Webb, he saw it too. He saw the weight pressing her down, one evening, after another long day, he found her alone again in the motor pool. Her sleeves rolled up, grease streaked across her arms, the tattoo catching the last light of the setting sun. "Sergeant," he said softly. She looked up, startled. For a moment, fear flashed in her eyes, as though she expected handcuffs, an arrest, her world ending here and now. But Webb only stepped closer, his voice quiet. "You're not alone in this." Her throat tightened. "Sometimes it feels like I am. You're carrying more than anyone should," he said. "But listen to me. You've done more with your silence, with your service, than most soldiers ever do shouting there. Names. You honor your father every day. Don't forget that." Her eyes shimmered, but she blinked the tears away. She couldn't afford to cry. Not here. Not where anyone might see. Instead, she nodded. "Yes, sir." But later, alone in the dark, she allowed herself to weep silently into her pillow. Not just for the fear, not just for the countdown, but for the little girl she had once been. The girl who had lost everything in a single night, who had grown into a woman always looking over her shoulder. And in those tears, one truth echoed. No matter how far she ran, no matter what name she wore, Roya Amdi would always live in her shadow. What happens when the walls you've built start to crack, not from outside, but from within? The message came on a secure line. General Webb had been expecting it, dreading it, and yet when the phone rang, his heart still clenched. "General Webb," the voice said. Calm, professional, but with an edge. "This is Colonel Sarah Martinez." "Thea." He closed his eyes. "Colonel." She didn't waste time. "We've been tracking several Taliban cells. They're not just targeting old interpreters. They're hunting families, children, even after all these years. We believe Jamil Amdi's daughter may still be alive." The words froze him. He forced his voice steady. "Why tell me this?" "Because if she is alive," Martinez said, "she's in danger. Our sources confirm 6 killings in the last 2 years. Refugees who thought they were safe in Europe, North America. The enemy has long memory, long reach." Webb's grip tightened. On the phone, the air in his office felt heavy. And what if she's not just alive, but... Here. There was a long silence. Then Martinez's voice dropped. "General, are we speaking hypothetically?" Webb's throat went dry. He stared at ghost tags in his hand. The promise, the secret, the soldier working right now in the motor pool. Grease on her hands, fear in her chest. "No," he said, quiet, final, not hypothetically. The admission hung between them like a detonation. Martinez didn't gasp, didn't shout. She was dia-trained for control. But her voice shifted. "Careful now." "Then, sir, we need to talk, off record." Immediately. 2 hours later, Webb sat across from her in a dim briefing room. The walls hummed with old fluorescent lights. Martinez laid a folder on the table. Red-stamped, classified. "We've suspected for years that Roya Amdi slipped through the cracks," she said, her voice measured. "Her father's service was exemplary. Her family was targeted. If she survived, she'd have needed a false identity." Webb stayed silent. Martinez flipped open the folder. "But what we didn't know was whether she lived. Until now, she slid a photo across the table. A blurred still from a surveillance drone Riley, working under a Humvee, tattoo visible in the light." Webb's chest tightened. "You already know." Martinez's eyes locked. On his, I needed confirmation. Now I have it. He braced for orders, for handcuffs. For the report that would end Riley's career, her life as she knew it. Instead, Martinez leaned in. "General, listen carefully. If her name surfaces publicly, she dies. The Taliban have networks waiting for a whisper. What she needs isn't exposure, it's protection." Webb blinked. The tension in his shoulders eased, just slightly. "You'll help her?" Martinez nodded. "Through channels, quietly. We can fold her into a protected witness relocation, legalize her as Riley Chun, transfer her record clean. But it won't be easy, and it won't be without risk." Webb's jaw set. "Do it." Martinez studied him. "You understand what this means? You concealed knowledge of her false identity. That alone could end your career. If we proceed, your name goes on the line with hers." He didn't hesitate. "So be it." For the first time, a flicker of respect crossed her face. She closed the folder. "I'll start the process, quietly, but until it's done, you need to keep her under the radar. No mistakes, no noise." When Webb left the room, the desert night felt sharper. He had taken the step. There was no turning back, but Riley didn't know any of this. She only knew that shadows felt closer. Every glance from another soldier lingered too long. Every call from command made her chest tighten. The routine security review loomed like a storm cloud. One afternoon, as she scrubbed grease from her hands, a young private approached her, nervous, shifting on his feet. Sarge?" Riley looked up, weary. "What is it?" He hesitated, then blurted. "Some intel guys were asking about you. Background stuff. Just thought you should know." Her stomach dropped. The rag slipped from her fingers. "What kind of stuff?" "Don't know," the private muttered. Eyes darting. "Just digging. Like where you're from, family, that kind of thing." Her heart hammered. She forced her face calm. "Thanks, Private. Get back to work. He nodded and left. Riley sat frozen, grease still streaked across her skin. The motor pool clattered around her, but it all felt far away. They were looking. They were pulling at the threads. Her breath quickened. She yanked her sleeve down over her tattoo, as though hiding it could erase everything. That night, she couldn't eat, couldn't sleep. She lay, staring at the ceiling, her chest rising too fast, her fists clenched. Her mind spiraled. If they find out, if they strip my name, if they send me back, if they tell the world who I am. She imagined men she'd never met whispering her father's name in back rooms. Across borders, across oceans, imagined them finding her face, her unit, her life. Her chest tightened until she couldn't breathe. She slipped from her cot and walked into the night, needing air. The desert stretched endless, the stars cold and sharp above, and suddenly, tears burned her eyes. She pressed her fists against them, fighting the sob that clawed up her throat. She hated it, hated the weakness, but it came anyway, tearing out of her in silence. She had built a life, earned her stripes, saved soldiers with her hands and grit, and yet one truth, one buried name, could take it all away. Footsteps. She turned, startled, wiping at her face. Webb stood a few feet away, quiet, watching. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then he stepped closer, his voice low. They're looking, yes, but listen to me. His eyes locked on hers. You're not going to lose this. Not if I can help it. Riley's throat tightened. How can you promise that? Because I already started, Webb said. The INOs. They're helping or building your case, legitimizing you as Riley Chun permanently. Her breath caught. The words landed like a blow. She stared at him, wide-eyed. You told them? I had to, he said firmly. But listen, Colonel Martinez isn't here to destroy you. She's here to protect you. She knows the risk. She knows what's at stake. Riley shook her head, tears spilling despite her will. If this goes wrong, if they find out who I am. Webb stepped closer, his voice steady. If this goes wrong, it costs me too. Do you understand? I've tied my fate to yours. I'm not walking away. Her breath broke. She looked at him, searching for doubt, but he meant it. She saw it in his eyes, heavy with years, with loss, with promises kept too late. And for the first time in 15 years, Riley felt something stir beneath the fear. Not relief, not safety, but hope, fragile, dangerous. Hope that maybe she could stop running. But in the shadows beyond Kandahar, far from the floodlights and engines, other eyes were watching, other names whispered. The hunt for Roya Amity had begun long before tonight, and it wasn't finished yet. What do you do when both the system and your enemies are closing in? For Riley, the days blurred together, mechanical repairs by daylight, restless thoughts by night. But beneath the hum of engines, beneath the routine of war, she felt it. The ground shifting under her feet, and she wasn't wrong. 3 weeks after Webb's late-night confession, orders came down. Not the kind that rattled through the whole base. These came quietly, a sealed envelope, a single directive. Sergeant Riley Chun was to report to a secure facility outside Kabul. Temporary assignment, no explanation, no questions. Riley's gut twisted as she read the paper. She knew what it meant. The hearings had begun. That night, Webb found her pacing the narrow barracks hall, her boots echoing in the stillness. She looked up sharply when he approached. They're moving me, she said. He nodded. It's the next step, quiet, off record. Her voice was tight. And if I don't come back? You will, Webb said firmly, but his eyes betrayed the weight in his chest. The facility was small, anonymous, a cluster of buildings surrounded by razor wire and silence. Inside, Riley faced rooms colder than any battlefield. Long tables, men and women in suits, not uniforms, questions sharper than bullets. She sat with her back straight, her palms flat against her knees. She had faced firefights. She had faced death, but this was different. Here, she wasn't Sergeant Chun. She wasn't a mechanic saving convoys with her hands. Here, she was a fraud under interrogation. They asked about her papers, her childhood, her father, every detail of the night that had ended her old life. Riley answered carefully, truth, but not all of it. She had learned long ago that survival depended on what you left unsaid. At one point, a man in a dark suit leaned forward, his voice cold. You do understand the penalty for fraud, don't you, Sergeant? You lied to gain entry into the United States military. That alone could end not only your career, but your citizenship. Her chest tightened. She forced herself not to flinch. Yes, sir. And yet here you sit, the man continued, expecting. Used to forgive years of deception. Her throat burned, but her voice held. I didn't come here expecting forgiveness. I came here because my father believed in what this country stood for. He died protecting your soldiers. And I've spent every day since trying to live up to that sacrifice. If that's not enough, then take the uniform from me, but don't say I haven't earned it. The room went silent. The man leaned back, his expression unreadable, behind her. Webb sat stiff in his chair, his jaw clenched. He had testified earlier about Jamil's service, about Ghost, about the girl who had saved his dog's final moments. He had put his career on the line with every word. Now, hearing Riley speak, he realized she didn't just deserve protection. She deserved belonging, but belonging wasn't guaranteed. Outside the walls of that facility, whispers traveled. In distant safe houses, men studied lists, families of interpreters, names marked for death. One of those names was Jamil Amdi. And beside it, daughter, unconfirmed. They weren't sure she lived. Not yet, but a whisper was enough. A single trace, a single slip, and their reach could extend halfway across the world. Back inside the tribunal, Riley sat through hours that felt like days. Martinez presented evidence. Jamil's documented heroism, his sacrifice, the credible threats against his family. Photos, reports, commendations, all sealed and forgotten until now. At one point, she placed Ghost's service record on the table. A military working dog, credited with saving soldiers from IEDs, from ambushes, died in service March 15th, 2010. Webb stared at that page, his chest tight. He remembered Ghost's last breath. Riley's small hands pressing against blood, her whisper in Dari. He had thought that moment was only grief. But now, looking at Riley across the room, he realized it had been the start of something else, a promise waiting to be kept. The hearings stretched for weeks. Some days Riley left the room feeling stronger. Other days, she returned to her quarters broken. Barely able to breathe, Webb checked on her often, though he tried not to hover. One evening, she sat on the edge of her cot, her hands clasped, her eyes hollow. I don't know if I can keep doing this, she whispered. Webb crouched beside her, his voice steady. You've done harder. You survived what no one else could. You built a life from nothing. This, he gestured around them, this is just another battlefield. Different weapons, same courage. Her eyes shimmered. What if I lose? Then we lose together, Webb said. But they weren't the only ones waiting for an answer. Across the ocean, the Taliban network received new intelligence. A rumor, a trace. An interpreter's daughter had not only survived, but was serving. In the American military, they didn't know her name yet. They didn't know her face. But they had a direction. Back at the facility, the final hearing approached. Riley was called in one last time. The room was smaller, fewer faces. The man in the dark suit sat across from her again. He studied her for a long moment. Then, slowly, he spoke. You've lived under a false name for 15 years. That cannot be undone. But what can't be ignored is this. He lifted a file, dropping it onto the table with a thud. Your service, 6 years, no failures, no dishonor. Soldiers are alive because of you. That matters. Riley's breath caught. She didn't speak. The man continued. We will process you as Riley Chun. Legally, permanently. Your record will transfer. Your service will stand. Her vision blurred. Her hands trembled. The man's voice hardened. But know this. Your past does not vanish. If your true name leaks, enemies will come. And if they do, it will not just be your life at risk. Riley nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks. I understand. The gavel came down, decision sealed. Later, alone in her quarters, she pressed her hand against her tattoo. Ghost, her father, the coordinates, the prayer. For the first time, the ink didn't feel like just a scar. It felt like proof that she had survived, that she had built something worth keeping. But even in that fragile relief, the fear remained. Somewhere out there, men were still whispering her father's name, still hunting, and they wouldn't stop until Roya Amdi was gone forever. For Riley, the answer didn't come in a courtroom or in a tribunal chamber. It came in the silence afterward, when the hearings ended, when the signatures dried, when the weight she had carried for 15 years finally shifted. Her name was Riley Chun, legally, permanently, no longer a shadow, no longer a whisper waiting to be exposed. But freedom didn't come without cost. General Webb bore the brunt, a formal reprimand, closed-door questioning that scraped his career raw. His 3 stars still gleamed on his collar. But the shine was dulled now. Everyone knew he had concealed something. He had risked reputation, rank, perhaps even prison. And yet, when he left that final hearing, he felt lighter than he had in years. He had kept a promise he hadn't known he was making when Ghost lay dying in his arms, but a promise nonetheless. Protect her. Protect the girl. He had failed once. Not this time. For Riley, the weeks that followed were strange. She returned to her unit under the same name she had always worn. But this time, it was hers in truth. The paperwork matched the reality. The shadow of discovery no longer stalked her every step. Her fellow soldiers noticed the change. She smiled more, spoke a little louder. The tension in her shoulders eased, if only slightly. Rodriguez even joked one evening, Damn, Chun, you look like you've finally figured out how to sleep. But relief was fragile, because somewhere beyond the wire, beyond the desert, beyond oceans, men still whispered her father's name. And whispers can travel far. One night, weeks after her return, intelligence intercepted chatter. A Taliban cell had confirmed what they suspected. The interpreter's daughter lived. Not only lived, but served. They didn't have her face. They didn't have her exact location. But they had enough to start hunting. When Webb read the report, his chest went cold. He called Martinez immediately. How far are they? He demanded. Far enough, she answered grimly. But close is only a matter of time. They're patient. They'll wait for a crack. Webb clenched his fist. Then we don't give them one. But he knew patience could outlast even the strongest defenses. The fight wasn't over. It might never be. And yet, life went on. Months later, on a clear February morning in Virginia, Riley stood tall in a federal courthouse. The judge's gavel echoed in the chamber. The words came, simple, almost ordinary, by the power vested in me. You are now a citizen of the United States. Riley's chest trembled. Her throat burned. For a moment, she could hardly breathe. She glanced across the room. Webb stood there, eyes steady, pride hidden beneath his stern exterior. Colonel Martinez sat beside him, arms crossed, her face unreadable. When the judge dismissed them, Riley turned to Webb. Her lips moved soundlessly. Thank you. He nodded once, his jaw tight. Ghost's tags heavy in his pocket. 6 months later, at Fort Bragg, the ceremony was quieter but no less powerful. Staff Sergeant Riley Amdi Chun, her name, both old and new woven into one, was promoted to Sergeant First Class. The room was filled with uniforms. Applause echoed as Webb stepped forward, pinning new stripes onto her sleeve. For a moment, his hand lingered, steadying hers. He leaned close, his voice low enough only she could hear. Your father would be proud. Her throat caught. She smiled through the weight in her chest. Her hand brushed unconsciously over the tattoo on her arm. I know, she whispered. And so would Ghost. The applause rose around them. Soldiers clapped her on the back, voices warm with congratulations. For them, she was a mechanic, a leader, a soldier who kept engines running and missions alive. They didn't know the story beneath her stripes. They didn't need to, because sometimes dignity doesn't shout its name. It works quietly, in silence, in grease-stained hands and sleepless nights. Later, as the ceremony ended, Riley stepped. Outside, the sun was bright, the air crisp. She tilted her head back, eyes closing against the light. For the first time in 15 years, she felt steady in her own skin. She was Roya. She was Riley. She was both. She was whole. Webb watched from a distance, hands folded behind his back. The promise had been kept. The girl who had crawled through gunfire to comfort a dying dog had become a woman who carried an army on her shoulders. And though danger still lurked, though whispers still carried her father's name in dark corners of the world, he knew this truth. She would not break, because survival wasn't her only legacy. Courage was, as Riley walked back toward the barracks. Her hand brushed her forearm again. Ghost to date the coordinates, the prayer once. It had been a secret burned into her skin. Now, it was a reminder, not of fear, not of hiding, but of a journey that had carried her from a dusty Afghan village to this moment of belonging. She smiled softly, the desert wind long behind her, the horizon wide ahead. And in the quiet, a moral lingered. Sometimes, dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts.